Hello and welcome to the second EU Code Week webinar. My name is Ariana Blažić and I'm very happy to welcome David Hellam, who will introduce us to computer-generated poetry with Scratch. David currently teaches high school computer science at one of the many international schools in Prague, having previously taught in a variety of computing courses in Kuwait, the Bahamas, and the UK. David has been a Code Week ambassador for the Czech Republic since 2014. Welcome, David. The floor is yours.
My name is David, and hopefully you can see the screen that I've shared with you already. And today we're going to be looking at how you can generate your own poetry with Scratch. This is one of the things I've been discussing with my students in the last few weeks, because one interesting thing that we've discovered about having your computer write poetry for you is that ChatGPT is a little bit rubbish at writing certain types of poetry, and there are reasons for that. And so therefore, if we want to be creative, it sometimes makes sense for us to be prepared to get our hands dirty and be a little bit more experimental than perhaps people might have thought is possible with Scratch. Anyway, brief introduction about me. So yes, my name's David Hellam. I've been teaching computing since 1988. So first of all in the UK, and then I moved to the Bahamas for a couple of years, and then Kuwait, and then now here I am in Prague in the Czech Republic. So I've taught on 3 different continents to children aged between 11 and 18. So I've taught a variety of different types of computing courses, but one thing that I've found ever since being introduced to Scratch in May 2007 is that it's an extremely powerful programming tool which can do an awful lot of things that sometimes we take for granted with other programming languages, and we may not think that something is sort of simple or that's supposed to be oriented for children, that we would think, oh, well, you know, why would you still use Scratch? And the answer is, well, why not? Okay, so anyway, I'm going to move on and point out that computer-generated poetry, again, isn't something new. As some of you have heard the quote before about, you know, if we've seen any further, it's because we are dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. And this is how I feel about this topic, because here's an extract from a book which was published in 1980 by Seymour Papert. This is from chapter 2, Mathophobia, the fear of learning, from Mindstorm. So he says, well into a year-long study that put powerful computers in the classrooms of a group of average 7th graders, the students were at work on what they called computer poetry. They were using computer programs to generate sentences. They gave the computer a syntactic structure with which to make random choices from given lists of words. The result is the kind of concrete poetry we see in the illustration that follows. In fact, I've been talking to my year 9 students about concrete poetry and saying, wouldn't it be nice to write a Scratch program that could write your love poem in the shape of a heart, or write your poem about snakes in a wiggly line? And so some of them thought, oh yeah, that sounds like fun, and it'd be interesting if they try any of that over the summer and what they come back with. Anyway, to carry on with Papert's comments here, one of the students, a 13-year-old named Jenny, had deeply touched the project staff by asking on the first day of her computer work, why were we chosen for this? We're not the brains. The study had deliberately chosen children of average school performance. And one day, Jenny came in very excited. She'd made a discovery. Now I know why we have nouns and verbs, she said. For many years in school, Jenny had been drilled in grammatical categories. She'd never understood the differences between nouns, verbs, and adverbs. But now it was apparent that her difficulty with grammar was not due to an inability to work with logical categories. It was something else. She had simply seen no purpose in the enterprise. She'd not been able to make any sense of what grammar was about in the sense of what it might be for. And when she'd asked about it, what it was for, the explanation the teachers gave seemed manifestly dishonest. She'd been told that grammar helps you talk better. In fact, tracing the connection between grammar and improving speech requires a more distanced view of the complex process of learning language than Jenny could have been given at the age she first encountered grammar. She certainly didn't see any way in which grammar could help talking, nor did she think her talking needed any help. Therefore, she learned to approach grammar with resentment. And as in the case of most of us, resentment guaranteed failure. But now, as she tried to get the computer to generate poetry, something remarkable happened. She found herself classifying words into categories, not because she'd been told she had to, but because she needed to. In order to teach her computer to make strings of words that would look like English, she had to teach it to choose words of an appropriate class. What she learned about grammar from this experience with the machine was anything but mechanical or routine. Her learning was deep and meaningful. Jenny did more than learn definitions for particular grammatical classes. She understood the general idea that words, like things, can be placed in different groups or sets, and doing so could work for her. She not only understood grammar, she changed her relationship to it. It was hers. And during a year with the computer, incidents like this helped Jenny change her image of herself. Her performance changed too. Her previously low to average grades became straight A's for the remaining years of school. She learned that she could be a brain after all. And this is what, over the years I've been teaching, I've seen again and again in the lives of many students, that once they see the sheer power of the computer to solve problems that are relevant to them, that's when progress can be made, not only in terms of learning computing, but also in getting more out of their experience of education. Just one illustration of this from last week, conversation with one of my year 8, so 12-year-old, 13-year-old student. And he said to me, why do you think, sir, that some children don't like coding? So I said to him, well, yeah, why do you like coding? He says, well, I like it because you don't necessarily get things right first time. So you've got to try different approaches. It makes you be creative until you can get the computer to do what you want it to do. Then you feel like you've really achieved something. And I thought, yes, yeah, you've got it. This is why he likes computing, because he gets far more out of coming up with challenges that are relevant to him and solving those challenges using an iterative process rather than just getting a load of ticks on a worksheet. And so this is the background I'm coming to from talking about computer-generated poetry. And so I'm assuming at this stage that many of us here have some experience working with Scratch already, that we've already learned a fair bit, and we're looking for ways for improving our classroom technique. And as I said, this is nothing new. This work with computer-generated poetry, people have been trying it for over 40 years, since Seymour Papert wrote down what he discovered with working with, again, middle school age students. I wouldn't tend to take this sort of work much younger, because there is a certain level of abstraction. I get a number of students who come to me at age 11 and they've only just started to understand, or they're now ready to start experimenting with variables. Obviously, some students come with already a good knowledge of variables, and also possibly, but only a small minority, will have started playing around with lists. But by the time we get to year 9, so age 13, 14, we should know about variables. And we should be, in some cases, starting to think, well, what are these data structures called lists? What can they do for me? And so one of the things I do with my students during this crucial year, when they're deciding what subjects do we want to specialize in, is to give them some creative examples of why certain programming structures are so useful for those of us who are planning on taking our skills that little bit further. Again, one of the things I point out to my students at that age is that even if at the end of year 9, if that's the end of their formal computing classes, that many of them, when it comes to creating their coursework for the International Baccalaureate, when they're age 17, 18, many of them will decide, oh, I need to generate or collect some data. I will write my own software to do it. So we have students who working in sports science, psychology, biology, environmental sciences, and physics, all coming up with experiments using the same programming skills that they learned in year 9. And it's amazing to me to see how enthusiastic many of them can be at that stage. Anyway, I'm going to go back to the presentation. I'm going to start off talking about haikus, because haikus are nice and simple and straightforward as a form of poetry. And again, some of our students like the idea of getting the computer to do the writing of the poetry for them. One of the big challenges that we sometimes find is that there's all sorts of words that we could string together, but what would make more sense? And again, one of the nice things about haiku is that you can write a Scratch program that will generate, say, 100 different haikus, and you can work your way through what's being said until you think, yeah, that's what I want to say. That's saying it in the way that I want. In case you're not familiar with haiku, it's just 17 syllables spread over 3 lines. So you have a 5-syllable line, a 7-syllable line, and then a 5-syllable line. So I asked ChatGPT if it would make me a haiku, and it did. Line 1 had 4 syllables, line 2 had 7 syllables, line 3 had 5 syllables. So it wasn't actually a haiku, but it did its best. But we've got more control over Scratch. This is why we want to use Scratch for this. And so we break our problem down. And I first of all get them to make some lists of words of the same type. And many of the students I get, yes, they're bright enough to understand what a noun, what a verb, what an adverb, what an adjective are. And so, and they understand about counting syllables. So that's not a big deal to them. But obviously, your experience may vary greatly. You may find that you need to go over these things, or you need to make things a bit simpler and just say, okay, we'll record and categorize things as place names, animal names, seasons, or whatever, and get them to put things together that way. And then, of course, we need to join these words together. And then the interesting part for the students, this is one area that we've had a great deal of fun talking about. How do we actually output our stuff? And again, within the studio, and I've already shared in the chat, but I'll drop it in again just in case, because I don't know whether those of you who've come in late can see the earlier items in chat. But I'm just going to drop in the chat the studio that I've put a few different examples in. And for those of you who want the presentation, again, it just so happens I've made public link to the presentation. So if you prefer to follow it on your own screen in your own time. And one of the things I've done is I've included some screenshots of the types of bits of code that we want to try and have running on our system. And so I'm going to switch to a Scratch screen in a minute, but I'll just show you some simple code snippet here, so that for this particular bit of poetry, we had a two-syllable adjective followed by a two-syllable noun followed by a one-syllable verb. And then we had for line 2, 2 syllables, 3 syllables, 2 syllables. And then for the third line, it was a two-syllable adjective followed by a three-syllable noun. Now, of course, it's entirely up to you or your students how much is going to be totally random here, or whether you're going to reuse or recycle things. This is one of the reasons why I'm just going to switch to the pound shop haiku. If I click on C inside on the pound shop haiku, some of you will notice that, let me just shrink this so that I can, you can see that I've just recycled and reused my my different lists. In fact, it means that there are only 3 lists of terms. If I just switch to this view, then I can say, look, here's my list of animals. And as you can see, they are all single syllable animals. If I switch on color, you'll notice all my colors are two syllables. And again, I can add things to this. So if I want bright pink, dark blue, you know, I can add these things. But here is where I've not been as efficient as I could have done, because you'll notice that in my code, I've hard coded a number. So for color, it says 1 to 5. And I know if I did this, some of my students would pick me up on this and say, couldn't you use the length tool here and put in? So for this one, oops, wrong block, length of, and then just drop the length block in. So length of size for each one, duplicate, and this one length.
Many purple fish.
Oops.
And yellow fish fight with tiny orange snail.
Now, as I said, this one's a bit of a pound shop one, so they all finish on the second line with the words fight with. But anyway, as I said, I can continue dropping these in, but you'll see also, this is again one of the things I know some of you, if you've worked with Snap before, you might prefer the way Snap is a little bit nicer in terms of how it arranges things so that you can see it more easily. But it's entirely up to you as to which languages you'd prefer to work with. Anyway, so as you can see, and again, one of the things I can do, which I like about Scratch, which many of you will know about, is that I can zoom out to see what I have missed out here. So that one's length of animal. This one is length of animal. And then when I've done this, it means that that I don't accidentally pull something out. Here I am breaking my my code. Okay, so I still need to put length of animal in that one. And then if I just add, so let me go back to this block here. So if I just add sort of mole, whale, and now when I press my green flag,
Giant yellow whale and purple fish fight with baby yellow snail, baby purple whale, and grayish purple little bright pink cat, and grayish bird fight with giant bright pink mole.
so as you can see, this just allows me to keep on adding bits and pieces to this. And so if I wanted to create something like this from the beginning, now, this is the point where I can say, would you like me to go over how I created those lists originally, or would you like me to go on to another example of a different type of poem? How confident do we feel? Do somebody say, yeah, I know how to do this already. Let's go on to the next stage. Let's look at something extra. You'll notice with this one, I displayed my text as large display variables. I also have the cat saying the stuff, and I've also used the speech, text-to-speech, in order to be able to have the there we go, text to speech. It's again, most of you will know that all you have to do is you just click on this tool, and then you've got the text to speech tools, you've got the pen tools, you've got the video sensing tools, you've got the translation tools. Music, we've had some interesting experiments on trying to add a musical accompaniment to our computer generated poetry. And so again, for some students, that's been a fun thing for them to do in order to have a more interesting experience of what they've wanted to share. I'm just going to have a quick look in the chat and see if anyone's saying, can we move on? I want to do. I'm not seeing anything yet, so I'm going to move on because I want to do a couple of other types of poems that, again, you may be less familiar with in terms of how you would write computer-generated poetry, and it gives me a chance to demonstrate a couple of extra bits and pieces that's, again, it's fun. So let me go back to the presentation. And so limericks, again, most of us are happy with limericks. It's a 5-line limerick, so you have the first, second, and fifth lines all rhyme. Third and fourth lines will also rhyme. But of course, then comes the question, how many syllables do you need for each line to scan properly? Usually we'll think in terms of 8 or 9 syllables. But again, yes, I asked ChatGPT to make me a limerick earlier, and whoa, fourth line was way, way, way longer than the third line. But give it its due, they all did actually rhyme properly. First, second, and fifth lines for the one that they wrote me did rhyme, and the third and fourth lines rhymed, but it didn't scan. The next question to ask, and again, this is one of the reasons why somebody might say, oh, this is a fun idea. How much do I want to randomize? And it may be that you'll decide, well, I only want to change the last word on each line of my limerick, because that will keep things simpler. And then, of course, the next question, how do you make sure your lines rhyme? how will you output your poem? And so again, in true TV presenter style, here's one I prepared earlier. And I'm not saying this is the best method. Some of you may decide that actually this is a completely rubbish method. You can think of a much nicer way of doing this. But this was one that I found easy enough to explain to my students, and they certainly told me that yeah, that they thought that it was an appropriate way. But then yeah, whether I'd get a different answer from my older students is another question. Okay, so as you can see, I have a number of lists. I have a list called rhymes, which is going to build up my my rhyming words that I'm going to add to the body of my poem. So because I'm only changing the last word, I can have the poem body as a list. So lines 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then whatever the last word of lines 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, I have 5 different lists for each of these. So I've got one for towns, one for different types of birds, one for body parts. You'll find out how this works in a minute. One for attributes, and one for companions. So yes, it's a massive mess of lists. And of course, this is one of these things where, if one of my students doing who like working with Python, they might say, I would much rather store this as a 2-dimensional array. It would make much more sense to me to do so, at which point I would say, go ahead and do it. But unfortunately, Scratch, we are limited to single-dimensional lists. The interesting thing is that one of the newer features when we import data, and I'll show you this when I do my acrostic at the end, when we import data from a CSV file now into Scratch, it will give me a choice as to which column of my CSV file I want to import into which list, which makes my life a whole lot easier. So all I did was I worked with a spreadsheet first in order to make a list of, let's just open up a blank spreadsheet. And so, I would put in, say, New York. I need a name of a type of bird that rhymes with New York. So stork. And then the companion for the stork, I would put hawk. So those would be for my line A. But let me just remove this and put this over here, because of course this is line 5. So A, and then I need 2 rhymes for choice number 1 for for rhyme B. So the original one I had was beak for the bird's body part, and then weak for the attribute for the bird, how it felt. And so I can show you how this all works. If I go to Limerick number 1 here, and again, let me just change this so that you can see my if I go to the variables box and then scroll down here, so I can say there's my poem body, and as you can see, it starts off, there was a young man from, and then we have to say which town it is. So if I open up my towns, and as you can see, I've got 4 towns: New York, Port Vale, Shenzhen, and Tobruk. And it just so happens that if I switch on birds, as you can see, stork rhymes with New York, quail rhymes with Port Vale, hen rhymes with Shenzhen, and rook rhymes with Tobruk. And then if I open up the companion, there we go. Hawk rhymes with New York, snail rhymes with Port Vale, wren rhymes with Shenzhen, and book rhymes with Tobruk. So those are all the last words I'm going to have for my line A lines of my limerick. So if I open up body parts and attributes, I see beak, weak, tail, frail, feet, beat, foot, and cute. Yes, it works. And so every time I press my green arrow, green flag, it gives me a new poem. So there was a young man from Port Vale who was pecked on the nose by a quail. He snapped off its foot, which made it so cute that it then ran away with a snail. Click on the green flag again, it gives me a different one. But of course, although we might say there are 16 different limericks, it does mean that we recognize many of these as being relatively similar to each other. If I'd made my lists longer, I would, of course, have been able to have a wider variety of limericks. And again, there's a simple thing to do is, first of all, we do this with Mad Libs as well. What I tell the students to do with a Mad Lib, for those who are looking for something else in terms of creative writing to work with Scratch, I get them to write out the story first, and then they circle which keywords are the ones that they want to make into variables. They then write the story out as a series of, say, commands or print. If you're using Python, again, you can use print commands. So you say each part of the story, but you'll use a variable as a placeholder for each of the different keywords. And again, so some of you, if you're thinking, yeah, I'd love to do limericks, write out a simple limerick first, and then decide what you're going to change. Are you going to change the person? I've got young man here. It could have been old man. It could have been young lady. There was again, the thing in terms of how many syllables you'd want to have here, but also how many syllables there. So if you're going to have, say, young lady, it would have to be a single syllable for the town, and work on that. So there was a young lady from York, or there was an old lady from Prague. But again, you then have to find sets of words that would rhyme with each of your end words. And the more sets of words sets of 3 words you could have, then the greater the variety of poems that you can create. Okay, so again, if you would like to spend a little bit of time going over that, then I'm more than happy. I'm just going to quickly check on the chat. If anyone wants anything clarified, put a note in the chat so I can see what you would like to look at. Otherwise, I'm going to move on. So I'm going to move on to acrostic poems. Now, acrostic poems, again, many of us.
Just a moment. Yes, there are no questions in the chat or comments, but I would invite everyone to please post your thoughts and questions for David, the chat, and then David will be happy to respond to.
Particularly if you feel either way. If you think I'm going too fast and you'd like to find out a little bit more in more detail, I'm more than happy if you're just here so you can look at these examples, dissect them over the week, and then if you come up with something that you'd like to add to the studio and say, this is what I created by remixing what you've done, or here's my approach, which I think is far superior, then by all means, do so. We're all here to learn from each other. But I'm going to move on to acrostic poems because, again, this is where I must admit, this is the biggest problem I've had with ChatGPT. When I've said to it, can you write me an acrostic poem? And of course, it sort of jumps to it and says, yes, of course I can write an acrostic poem for you. Here it is. And you look at it and you think, you've missed some letters out. You've repeated certain letters. You've gotten bored and stopped 3 letters before the end. But of course, ChatGPT is quite merrily saying, yes, I've done it for you. What more do you want? And so you click on the regenerate, the button say, do this again. And it gives you an even worse example. And it confidently says, so this one's better, isn't it? Like, no, it's even worse. It's even more hideous. And so, yes, acrostic poems. Well, I've been joking with my students here as to when would you write an acrostic poem, or where would you see them? And we decided that the obvious one is tacky souvenir shops, where you would go and you'd find these, postcards and plaques, flowery border, perhaps an interesting colored background, perhaps a crazy font for it, and you'd have things about the attributes of a mother, brother, sister, or whatever. And so, yeah, I'm just going to show you. And here's again one I've created earlier. So here we can see poetry, positivity, the principle of kinship. We're thinking, this is incredibly syrupy poem, but again, you can see that the same sort of tools that I created for putting my text on the screen, I've done the same thing here. So basically, it's just a set of costumes. Now, I've chosen with this one, I was discussing this with my students, because we've done stamping of characters onto the screen before. But when the font size becomes quite small, because it stamps as a bitmap, the clarity and quality is not really so good. So we discussed whether it would be nicer to clone, but of course there's a problem. I can illustrate this later on for you, so you can say, yeah, this is why you should have stuck to stamping things, because you can only have 300 cloned sprites on the screen. And we discussed why this was so, and we decided it was because the Scratch team didn't want students to be able to create a toxic Scratch program that when you visit it would use up so much of your computer's RAM in creating so many clone sprites that your computer becomes incredibly slow and sluggish and laggy, basically unusable until you close that browser window and manage to get that RAM back. So this is the limit of 300 cloned sprites. So since I'm using a sprite for each character, that means that if my poem goes over 300 characters, then it stops displaying new characters. I'll show you an example of that in a minute so you can see why this might not be the best method. So you may decide that instead you'd want to use the pen tools, because within the pen tools we have the stamp tool, so you can stamp your character instead. But let's get back to what we've got here. So as I said, I've got this one here. You'll notice that I like making my own blocks. I introduced this with year 9. Sometimes you find a year 8 student who is ready for this step. But the main reason why I introduce it in year 9 is because when we do other programming work in year 10 and year 11, it's much more important for us to be able to do both encapsulation and, if we use these fancy computer science terms, encapsulation and generalization, which basically means making blocks, and more importantly, making blocks that use variables. The one thing that Scratch doesn't do, and again, some of you might say, this is why you should be using Snap, because Snap does do this, is that it doesn't return a value. So instead, you just have a variable whose value changes. And so this is my lookup here. And again, as I was saying, one of the limitations of Scratch, but that's okay. We can write our own routine to do this. And again, some of you might decide this is a really rubbish way of doing it. Again, I stole this idea from one of my year 8s a few years back, who decided he wanted to create an ASCII text to binary converter and vice versa, so that you could use it to create a sequence of zeros and ones from a message you had in normal text, and then be able to convert that sequence of zeros and ones back into plain text to read it from the ciphertext. And it was a nice idea. I thought, yes, yeah, I shall steal this and adapt it and use it. And so all it does here is that I start with character number 1, and if I just change the size here, so if I go back to my block, my lists, my variable blocks, and if I open up my lookup, as you can see, it just looks up. If you type A, B, C, D, or E as a character, then it will find out, is it character number 1, character number 2, character number 3, and so on. So that means that if I then, again, let's go back to my nouns here, and as you can see, they all start with a letter in alphabetical order. I've also written a simple shuffling function, again, just really to show my students some of the things you can do if you want to shuffle things. And so I've done it. Yeah, again, you don't have to have a temporary variable here, but to me it makes far more sense to use a temporary variable for this type of, and since I am shuffling body text, if I open up body text, you'll see, oh look, it's all shuffled. And I can decide how many times I want to shuffle my body text. So if I say I want to shuffle it, say 10 times, and then click on my block here, it swaps 10 pairs of my values. If I say I just want it to shuffle 1 time, it will just shuffle 1 pair of my values. In fact, it shuffled 2 of the ones that were outside of what I was looking at there. Let's shuffle again. As you see, it saw that one swapped with one that was outside of my field of vision there. And let me just get rid of those again so that's okay. And so if I click on my green file, I'll just talk you through the code first so you can see what's happening here. Let me just shrink this a little. And so to write my acrostic, first of all, you'll notice when I press my green flag, it shuffles my body text and then asks, I put in what's your name, because my original idea was that we would do this so you could type someone's name in and it would give a syrupy sort of poem to say what a wonderful person this individual is. But we found it worked far better for things like father and mother. So if I just click on here, I'll show you this. So all it does is that for every single character you type in, it will work out which number of the nouns we're going to stick at the beginning, and it's then going to use one of the items from my body text, and then you'll notice that all this does, it just goes in the opposite order. So if it's an A, it will give the word that begins with a Z. If it's a B, it will give the word that begins with a Y, and so on. So if I type in father, let me just magnify this so it's a little bit easier for us to read. And then click on this. So, a bit too late for Father's Day, obviously. That was last weekend. But here we have the most syrupy computer-generated poetry that I can make. So faith helps to develop understanding, aspiration, giving all who need it zestfulness. Trustworthiness shows the depth of greatness. Hope when everyone needs superiority. Enthusiasm fulfills a longing for vitality, and resolve where none lack individuality. And again, every time I click on this and type in father or mother, it will give me a different bit of body text. But the way I've set this one up, it's always going to be the same text at the end there. So R is always going to be resolve, and therefore the matching word is going to be individuality. All that's going to change, and even if I put in a different word like, say, mother, again, as you can see, resolve fulfills a longing for individual, and you can keep on doing this until you get the random poem or the random lines that you think work best for a piece of poetry. So yeah, it's like using Mozart's dice to write a piece of music, or for people who want to look at other things, using genetic algorithms to come up with an interesting piece of music. So anyway, I've got about 15 minutes left, haven't I? So oops. Let me just go back to here. So there's my code for my acrostic. And again, the big question comes again, how are you going to output your text? So I'm going to write an acrostic, but I'm going to use the variable display for my acrostic instead, mainly just to point out something that, again, some of you may have thought about, but then again, you might not, or you might have considered and then decided, oh, that would be a rubbish way of doing this. Okay, so let me go back to Scratch. And so, yeah, here I have, as you know, I've got a giant Scratch cat here. Let me just change his size back to, there we go, a small Scratch cat I can put in the corner here. If I wanted to hide him, if I decide I don't want him on the screen at all, but it may be useful for me to have him say things. I could, of course, make the backdrop say things instead if I wished. But as I said, this time round, although I could, because again, some of you may want to see how it's demonstrated, could use text-to-speech. And so I can just take a speak block. You can decide on the voice. And again, many of my students, first thing they do is, what happens if I use kitten? And of course, it just goes meow. For every single word, it just goes meow. It's annoying. Tenor.
Hello.
And set language to English. It does affect the type of accent that it will use for your text, because it will try and work out what rules should be used in order to pronounce various words correctly in that particular language. So it's an interesting one to play with, but not for today. So I want some lists. As I said, I'm going to create another acrostic here. And so in true TV presenter style, here's one I prepared earlier. So if I click on my acrostic holiday word list, here you can see I have 3 word lists, all going from A to Z. And so the next thing I want to do is put that text into my acrostic poem. So I go to variables, and since I've got my variable there, and I never use a variable called my variable, first one I will call noun. The next one I'm going to call comparison. It's So it's called something different. I could have called them word 1, word 2, word 3. And of course, straight away, this is the point we say, that's really stupid of you. You wanted to make lists here. So let me just delete these two variables because I need to make lists. So comparisons and attributes. And of course, now comes the clever thing. I just right click on here and I choose import. And here's the CSV file that I made with 3 columns. So column 1 is my nouns. Column 2 is my comparisons. And column 3 is my attributes. And so if I just want the cat to say my acrostic poem before I have it displayed or whatever, one of the things I'm thinking about, which would be a fun thing to do, would be to make a little box with a sensor on it so that when you pick up the box, it can detect movement. So you can use, say, like accelerometer, or you could have a tilt switch in there, or you could just have, yes, the very, very simple thing. You could have a light sensor or a proximity sensor facing the facing the ground. So when you pick it up, it detects, oh, there's this box has been moved. I can see light, or my infrared beam is now bouncing further away from where it was. So you can then have it then play your speech. But to do this, I need some random numbers. I also need my word. So make a variable. And of course, one of the nice things about Scratch that I know some of you are familiar with is that we have the backpack. So if there's something you want to move from one program to another, then you can go to one piece of software that you've been working on and just say, I want that particular block. So if I open up my backpack, right, there's my script there. So if I now go back here, and there's my script here, so I can drop it into here from there. Now, obviously, I need a list called lookup. And of course, this was so easy, it's not worth me. Oops, okay. You've already created it for me, have you? Yes, it's created, but it's blank at the moment. So I want A, B, C, D, E, F, B, H, I A K L M N O P Q R S T U V W X Y Z. There we go. I've got my lookup done now. And so make available pointer. So I want to repeat however many characters there is within my word. I need to set my pointer to 1 at the start of the word. And then what I want is for I need to change pointer by 1. And so first of all, I need to look up. So let me just close my backpack there and go to my blocks. So I need to look up letter pointer of word, and then I want to say, and it's going to be a number of different things I'm going to be joining together. So I need several join blocks here. And then all I need to do is go back to my lists, and I want for nouns, I want item character number. And then I'll just put some random ones in for the other two, because I can see I've only got a minute left. So drawing comparison. With attributes. And then I can put that in the speak. If I also want the scratch cat to say this, I can also do looks and then just stick that in there. So duplicate this. So that
Hello, 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 hello.
Okay. So let me just run this. I should really put a little green flag on there.
Hello, 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 hello.
And it helps if I put this in the right block, doesn't it?
Parks, more lovely than garden parties. Resorts, more superb than home. Adventures, more glorious than musical performances. Getaways, more zestful than kayaking. Unwinding, more yummy than nobility. Expeditions, more tranquil than Xanadu.
Okay. So I just need to tidy that up by putting a space there. And let me just move that line there so that it prints the text before it says it.
Parks, more delightful than Zumba dances. Resorts, more joyful than dreamland. Adventures, more worthwhile than joviality. Getaways, more relaxing than Zumba dances. Unwinding, more amazing than yonder shores. Expeditions, more kind than ocean views.
And of course, that was stupid of me. That's because I've put random data there. It's giving me a completely different acrostic that's being spoken compared to the one that is being typed. Now, of course, that would be easy to fix. All I would need to do is just create two more variables and stick them in there. Now, shall I do that, or do we have any final questions before we pack up?
David, thank you very much for this. Also, this how to spot a mistake and correct it. But for now, we only have many thanks here in the chat and interesting session. And Samuel says that in a STEAM perspective, these examples may help to work together with our colleagues of humanities. So I think this is really, really a great idea that computer science teachers can invite their language teachers, for example, and that then they can work together on an interdisciplinary project. So excellent idea. And yes, we have a fantastic, thanks a lot. Thank you. Very interesting, very inspiring. And I personally think it can be easily used in the classroom. So that's from the chat, David.
Okay. So that one's easily fixed. Sometimes I will deliberately, I know this makes me sound evil, doesn't it? Sometimes I will deliberately do something like this just so that I know it will go wrong, and then say, okay, so how are you going to correct this? This is, the classic is what we call a logic error, where the computer does exactly what you tell it to do, but it isn't what you actually want it to do. And it is one of the things I like to do with my computer science students when they're older is get them to do a show and tell, where they will show a piece of code that they're working on. And I encourage them to, if it's something that's not quite working, but they would value the opinion of their peers, that they show us what it does at the moment and then say, okay, what would you do to improve it?
Parks, more exciting than yonder shores. Resorts, more tranquil than idyllic haunts. Adventures, more peaceful than nobility. Getaways, more yummy than kayaking. Unwinding, more zestful than dreamland. Expeditions, more relaxing than yonder shores.
And there we go. There's our program with the logic error corrected. And I will put that one, I will share it and put it into the studio. And if any of you, as I said, if you do have something you'd like to add to the studio, then certainly send me a link to it, and we'll see whether we can add it to the items there. So, spoken acrostic. And all I need to do is down at the bottom here, add to studio, and then put it in my poetry project studio. And there we go, it's done. So if there's no further questions, we've done our hour. In fact, we've done a little more than an hour.
Yes.
So thank you very much for all being so patient, and let's see what you can do with your classes.
Thank you very much, David. It's been really, really inspirational. All these ways how we can teach coding and literacy, as some of our participants have mentioned in the chat. Yes, I too invite all our participants to try it out. If you follow this link that David has shared at the beginning to the Scratch Studio, you will also be able to remix David's projects. Am I right, David?
Yes.
Yes. So give it a try. You don't have to start from scratch. You can play with the code that David has shared. And please feel free to share your poems, haiku, limericks, and acrostic poems with David in his studio, so that we can have a collection of poetry generated with Scratch. Thank you so much, David, for your time, for sharing your extensive experience and knowledge. And thank you to all the participants who joined us today. And we hope to see you soon in the third webinar that we will be organizing soon. So stay tuned and keep in touch. Thank you and bye-bye.
Okay, bye.